End quote. Ma and Oppos. You and Oppos. LL need to order something or give up the table for a paying customer. End quote. The old woman didn't and Oppos. T look up from the menu right away. When she did, her eyes seemed to slide past the young manager standing over her, as if the girl were a reflection in a window rather than a person. End quote. Just one more minute, end quote, she said. Priya Nash crossed her arms. The Larkspur table would fill up soon. It always did on Saturday mornings, when the after-church crowd and the runners from the Greenway collided in the doorway, and the woman at table 2 had been sitting there for 25 minutes without ordering so much as a coffee. Her coat, a good wool coat once, hung open and crooked on her shoulders as though she and Oppos D put it on without checking a mirror. Her silver hair had come loose from its clip on one side. Her hands, folded on the laminated menu, trembled with a small constant tremor that had nothing to do with cold. To Priya she looked like someone who and Oppos D wandered in from outside hoping nobody would notice she couldn't and Oppos T pay. Priya had worked in restaurants long enough to recognize the look. She and Oppos D also worked in restaurants long enough to have been burned by giving people the benefit of the doubt. End quote. This ISN and Oppos T a warming shelter, end quote. Priya said, quieter now but not kinder. End quote. I and Oppos am going to have to ask you to leave. End quote. At the booth beside them, Nora Ellison set down her fork mid-cut. She was 38, dark circles worn into her face like something permanent, cutting a plate of eggs into halves and then quarters for her son. Eli was 7, small for his age, with a green knit hat pulled low over his ears even indoors, because the apartment had been cold that morning and he hadn't and Oppos T wanted to take it off. 7 months earlier, Nora had been a senior systems technician in cold chain operations, the kind of job that came with a company badge and dental insurance and a 401k match. Now she drove for a grocery delivery app 3 nights a week and picked up appliance repairs on the side. And that morning, after putting gas in a car that badly needed new brakes, she had $11.40 left until Wednesday. 1 plate. 2 forks. She and Oppos D told Eli she wasn't and Oppos T hungry so there and Oppos D be enough on his side of the table. Eli had been watching the old woman since she walked in. He watched people the way some kids watched cartoons, carefully like there might be a test later. End quote. Mom, end quote, he whispered. End quote. She and Oppos shaking. End quote. Across the aisle the old woman pushed her chair back slow, the legs scraping against the tile. End quote. I understand, end quote, she said to no one in particular, and reached for her coat button with fingers that couldn't and Oppos T quite find it. Nora had not planned on saying anything. She had spent the last 7 months learning the specific exhaustion of trying not to be noticed. Not by landlords, not by old co-workers, not by the school office when the lunch account ran low. Getting involved in someone else and Oppos trouble was a luxury she and Oppos D stopped being able to afford, along with brake pads and dental cleanings and the 2 hours a week she used to spend just sitting somewhere quiet, not fixing anything. But she remembered with a clarity that still surprised her, the walkout of Larkspur Provisions and Oppos cold storage facility on her last day, carrying a cardboard box past people she and Oppos D trained while a security guard who and Oppos D once shared his lunch with her held the door and wooed and Oppos T meet her eyes. She remembered what it felt like to leave a room pretending the leaving didn't and Oppos T hurt. End quote. Ma and Oppos end quote, Nora said. The old woman stopped. Nora slid out of the booth enough to pull a chair free from the empty table behind her. End quote. You and Oppos welcome to sit with us. End quote. Priya and Oppos expression sharpened. End quote. Ms. Ellison she hasn't and Oppos T ordered anything, end quote. End quote. She and Oppos sitting at a table that and Oppos already paid for. End quote. End quote. You can and Oppos T turn one breakfast into free seating for strangers. End quote. End quote. We and Oppos not asking for a second meal, end quote. Nora looked at the old woman whose eyes had come into focus for the first time, fixed now on the empty chair like it might vanish if she looked away. End quote. You Don and Oppos T have to, end quote, Nora added. End quote. But you can. End quote. That undid something. The woman and Oppos hand still holding the coat button went still. End quote. I know, end quote, she said, and there was a rawness under it that made even Priya pause. Nora flagged a server. End quote. Could we get one more bowl, please? Just an empty one. End quote. Priya stepped closer, voice dropping. End quote. You cannot start giving away food that ISN and Oppos. T yours to give. End quote. End quote. I and Oppos am not giving away food. I and Oppos am sharing mine. End quote. Nora divided the skillet with the edge of her fork, a small share for herself, a smaller one for Eli, most of it into the empty bowl. Eli, without being asked, moved a triangle of toast from his own plate onto the bowl and Oppos' edge. Then he slid out of the booth, unwound the green scarf-thin length of yarn his aunt had knit him last winter, the only accessory he owned that wasn't an Oppos, a hand-me-down, and walked it around the table. End quote. You can borrow this, end quote, he said. End quote. Until your ride comes. End quote. The old woman stared at the scarf as if it were something spoken in a language she used to know. End quote. My ride. End quote. Eli nodded, serious as a judge. End quote. My mom says nobody should have to wait outside when it and Oppos' this cold. End quote. Nora had never said those words. She didn't and Oppos' correct him. The woman let the boy loop the scarf around her neck. It smelled faintly of laundry soap and the crayons Eli kept in his coat pocket. End quote. Thank you, end quote, she said so quietly it barely cleared the noise of the café. Eli climbed back into the booth, satisfied the way children are satisfied by problems that have been solved. End quote. I and Oppos am Eli, end quote, he said. The woman touched the loose end of the scarf. End quote. Margaret. End quote. Nora pushed the shared bowl an inch closer. End quote. I and Oppos am Nora. End quote. She had no way of knowing, not yet, that the trembling woman now wearing her son and Oppos' scarf was the majority owner of the company that had fired her. Margaret looked at the modest portions divided among the three of them, a scrape of egg here, a corner of toast there, and understood in the particular way grief sometimes clears a mind of its usual fog, exactly what she was looking at. End quote. You were already sharing this. End quote. End quote. We still are, end quote, Nora said. Margaret noticed the water glass in front of Nora. No coffee, no side, nothing extra, and the way she and Oppos' nudged the larger share of hash browns toward Eli and Oppos' side of the table when the boy wasn't and Oppos' looking. End quote. You should eat something yourself. End quote. End quote. So should you. End quote. Neither of them moved for a moment. Then Eli picked up his fork, matter of fact as only a 7-year-old can be about grief he doesn't and Oppos' yet understand. End quote. It and Oppos' better warm, end quote, he said, and that broke whatever held Margaret and Oppos' face so still. Something in it loosened. Not quite a smile, but its early draft. They ate. Outside, the wind pushed the last of the maple leaves down Larkspur Avenue in long dry scrapes. Inside, the cafe smelled of coffee and browned butter, and the cinnamon rolls warming behind the glass. Margaret took one bite of egg and set her fork down. Her eyes filled without warning. Eli glanced at his mother, unsure whether he and Oppos' caused it. Nora shook her head gently. Not you, sweetheart, and slid the napkin dispenser an inch closer to Margaret instead of offering words. End quote. I and Oppos am sorry, end quote, Margaret said. End quote. You Don and Oppos' have to be. End quote. Margaret looked past them, toward table 7 near the window, the one Priya had made her leave. End quote. My daughter used to sit there. Every time we came in, end quote. Her hand found the edge of the table like it was something to hold on to. End quote. She loved the blueberry pancakes here. Even after she was old enough to know they weren't and Oppos' very good, end quote. Eli studied the laminated menu photo. End quote. They look good in the picture. End quote. Margaret laughed, but it cracked apart halfway through and came out closer to a sob. End quote. Today would have been her birthday. End quote. Nora didn't an Oppos' ask how. She didn't an Oppos' offer the sentence people reach for in moments like this. The one that makes grief lighter for everyone except the person carrying it. She just let the quiet sit there unfilled, which was its own kind of company. Eli touched Margaret and Oppos' sleeve. End quote. My dad died too. End quote. Nora and Oppos' S hand paused over her fork. Eli rarely brought it up first, usually. A bead of condensation ran down the inside of the glass and pooled on the tile below. Underneath the case, the compressor was making a low, uneven hum. Not the steady drone it should have had, but something ragged, catching every few seconds like a person breathing wrong. End quote. That case needs to be checked, end quote, Nora said. Priya glanced back, already irritated. End quote, it does that sometimes. The door was open during the morning delivery. End quote. End quote, it and Oppo's. S been running warm longer than a delivery would explain. End quote. End quote, you and Oppo's. Ria customer here. End quote. End quote, yes. End quote. End quote. Then let the staff handle it. End quote. End quote, I and Oppo's. Am trying to help you handle it before it becomes a health department problem instead of a Tuesday problem. End quote. Nora nodded at the fogged glass. End quote. Move the dairy and cream products to the walk-in. Hold anything that in Oppo's. S been above safe temperature. Call your refrigeration contractor. End quote. Priya and Oppo's. S eyes dropped to Nora and Oppo's. S jacket. A faded delivery app pullover with a logo half peeled from the chest. End quote. And what exactly qualifies you to diagnose our equipment from a booth? End quote. End quote. 13 years in commercial refrigeration. End quote. End quote, and now. End quote. Nora understood the question underneath the question. Now you deliver groceries. Now you patch washing machines in strangers' and Oppo's basements. Now people see the jacket and assume the job you lost proves you never deserved it in the first place. End quote. Now I and Oppo's. Am telling you the products in that case need to be checked with a calibrated thermometer before anyone eats them. End quote. End quote, we have procedures. End quote. End quote. Then follow them. End quote. A young server named Sophia, maybe 19, stepped out from behind the counter, drying her hands on her apron. End quote, I can check it. End quote. End quote, I said it and Oppo's. S fine, end quote, Priya snapped. Sophia looked at the display anyway. End quote, it says 48. End quote. End quote, because the door was open. End quote. Nora kept her voice level. End quote. Check the milk near the center of the case. That and Oppo's. S usually the last thing to warm. End quote. Priya looked around at the handful of customers who had started watching. Forks paused halfway to their mouths. End quote, fine, end quote, she said, jaw tight. End quote, we and Oppo's. I'll prove it and Oppo's, S fine. End quote. Sophia sanitized a probe thermometer and pushed it into an open carton of milk. She waited, glancing between the display and the readout in her hand like she was hoping the numbers would disagree with each other. 47. The room and Oppo's. S mood changed all at once, the way a kitchen changes when something starts to burn. Nora stood but stayed several feet back from the case, hands loose at her sides. End quote. Move everything to the walk-in. Mark the time you pulled it. Nothing gets served out of that case until a contractor clears it. End quote. Priya opened her mouth to argue, and the alarm sounded again, louder this time, more insistent. Sophia started moving trays without waiting for permission. Another employee joined her, and within a minute the case sat half empty, its door propped open, its ragged hum somehow louder now that there was nothing left inside to hide it. Nora sat back down. She hadn't an Oppo's. T touched a single panel or claimed to know the exact cause of the failure. She and Oppo's. D recognized a warning and told the people in the room how to verify it, which was, she thought, the entire job and always had been. Margaret had watched all of it without speaking. End quote. You knew what that sound meant, end quote, she said. End quote. I knew what it could mean, end quote, Nora said. End quote. There and Oppo's. S a difference. End quote. End quote. A significant one. End quote. End quote. A warning tells you to stop and check. It doesn't end Oppo's. T give you permission to guess, end quote. Nora glanced at the case, at Sophia still hauling trays with the quiet competence of someone who and Oppo's. D remember this morning for a long time. End quote. Guessing is how people get hurt. Or how a company loses $5,000 of dairy and calls it bad luck instead of a bad relay. End quote. A man in a dark wool coat pushed through the door a few minutes later, late 60s, silver-haired, visibly relieved the moment he spotted Margaret. And quote, Mrs. Voss. And quote. Priya went very still. The man crossed the room quickly. And quote, I and Oppos, I'm sorry. There was nowhere to park, I had to circle the block twice, and quote. And quote, it and Oppos. S all right, Frank. End quote. Priya and Oppos. S gaze moved from the woman in the borrowed green scarf to a black and white photograph mounted near the register, one Nora had walked past a dozen times without really seeing it. A much younger Margaret stood beside a man in front of a small storefront with a hand-painted sign. Underneath, in gold script, Margaret and Amp. Daniel Voss, founders, Larkspur Provisions. The Larkspur table was owned by Larkspur Provisions. Every paycheck in the building had Margaret Voss and Oppos' name on it somewhere, 3 or 4 signatures removed. End quote, Mrs. Voss, end quote. Priya said, voice gone thin. End quote, I didn't and Oppos' recognize you. End quote. Margaret looked at her for a long moment. That, her expression seemed to say, was precisely the problem. Priya took a step forward. End quote, I thought, end quote. End quote, yes, end quote, Margaret said. End quote, you did. End quote. The café had gone quiet enough that the compressor and Oppos' dying hum was the loudest thing in the room. End quote. I was trying to protect the dining experience, end quote. Priya said. Margaret touched the scarf at her throat. End quote, from what? A grieving old woman sitting alone at a table? End quote. Priya had no answer for that. End quote, how many people, end quote, Margaret asked, end quote, have you sent back out into the cold because you decided on sight that they couldn't and Oppos' afford to matter? End quote. Priya and Oppos' mouth opened. Nothing came out. Margaret didn't and Oppos' demand she be fired on the spot. Instead she turned toward the refrigerated case. End quote. Preserve this morning and Oppos' camera footage. Keep the temperature logs, the alarm history, and the maintenance records for that unit. End quote. End quote. Yes, ma and Oppos am. End quote. End quote. Call your license contractor today. Document everything they find. End quote. End quote. Yes, ma and Oppos am. End quote. Margaret turned to Sophia, who was still holding a tray of rescued cream. End quote. Thank you for checking. End quote. Sophia looked for a moment like she might cry from sheer relief. End quote. The numbers didn't and Oppos' match. I didn't and Oppos' want to guess. End quote. End quote. That instinct, end quote, Margaret said, end quote, is worth more to this company than most of what and Oppos' on my org chart. Don and Oppos' let anyone talk you out of it. End quote. Frank helped Margaret into a black sedan waiting at the curb, Eli and Oppos' scarf still looped around her neck. As the car pulled away, Nora sat back down across from her son and counted the bills left in her wallet without really needing to. End quote, are we in trouble? End quote, Eli asked. End quote, no, end quote. End quote, did we spend too much? End quote. Nora looked at the empty skillet, scraped clean between the 3 of them. End quote. We spent what we chose to spend. End quote. Eli considered this with the seriousness he brought to most things. End quote, was she really rich? Like the picture said. End quote. End quote, looks that way. End quote. He seemed pleased by this, in the uncomplicated way children are pleased by plot twists. End quote, she still needed my scarf though. End quote. End quote, yes, end quote, Nora said. End quote, she did. End quote. She drove him to his aunt and Oppos' afterward. Saturdays were her long shift, 6 hours behind the wheel of her own car delivering other people and Oppos' groceries, and on the drive back alone with the radio off and the heater rattling, her mind went, as it often did on quiet stretches of road, to the room she tried hardest not to revisit. 13 years earlier, Nora had walked into Larkspur Provisions and Oppos' cold storage division as a 25-year-old apprentice technician, barely out of a 2-year program, terrified of the compressors that seemed to hum louder than anything she and Oppos' trained on. She and Oppos' worked her way up slot by slot, apprentice technician, senior technician, systems lead, through years that included marrying a high school teacher named Marcus, having Eli, and then 3 years ago, losing Marcus to an illness that took 11 months to finish what it started. She had gone back to work 14 days after the funeral because grief didn't end oppose. Pay rent and neither did vendors are threatening penalties on the lease. You and oppose. The only person in this building treating a rounding error like a moral crisis and quote. It and oppose, s not a rounding error. It and oppose, s outside spec. And quote. Then revise the report to reflect that the variation is within expected seasonal conditions. And quote. It is an and oppose t. And quote. Desmond had smiled, the particular smile of a man used to people eventually agreeing with him. And quote. Nora. You and oppose. We been here 13 years. You know how this works. Everyone signs the report that lets the building open, and then engineering keeps monitoring after the fact quietly the way it always has. End quote. She had said no. Twice more, in increasingly formal terms. In email she still had saved to a personal drive because some instinct, not quite foresight, more like stubbornness, had told her to keep copies of everything. 2 weeks later, she was removed from the North Range project and quote, pending a review of judgment and team alignment, and quote. A month after that, she was terminated, the file listing her separation as in quote, insubordination, failure to support management direction and quote, no safety violations, no attendance issues. One written warning issued 9 days before her termination, for refusing to sign a commissioning report she believed was false. She had appealed. Human Resources told her management had acted within its discretion. She had gone home that night and told Eli, then Six, that she had a new job now, one where she got to drive around and see lots of different houses, and he had thought that sounded like an upgrade, and she had let him believe it because some truths are too heavy to hand a 6-year-old before bed. She sold the truck within 2 months to make rent. The termination language, insubordination, was a word that traveled fast through an industry as small as commercial refrigeration, made 3 other employers quietly stop returning her calls. She and Eli left the duplex they and oppose shared since Marcus died for a smaller apartment above a laundromat, where the radiator clanked all night and Eli had started sleeping with his hat on because his room never quite warmed up. She had never told him why they moved. She had never told anyone really outside of the appeal letter that went nowhere. It wasn't and oppose, shame exactly, she knew she and oppose, been right, but there wasn't and oppose, a version of the story short enough to tell a child or satisfying enough to tell a stranger that didn't and oppose, end with, and none of it mattered anyway. Sitting in her car outside her sister and oppose's apartment building, engine ticking as it cooled, Nora thought about the old woman in the green scarf, and the photograph by the register, and felt something she hadn't and oppose let herself feel in 7 months. The small, dangerous flicker of hope that somewhere in that company, someone with actual power might still care what the truth cost the people who told it. She put the car in drive and didn't and oppose let herself finish the thought. 2 days before the incident at the Larkspur table, though Nora had no way of knowing it, Desmond Stroud had stood in his office on the 31st floor of Larkspur Provisions and Oppose, Denver headquarters, looking out over the skyline on the phone with a produce vendor named Oscar Reyes. And quote, I and Oppose, we read your quality report and quote, Desmond said, pleasant as a man discussing weather. And quote, you and Oppose, we flagged 3 shipments this quarter for cold chain temperature excursions, and quote. They exceeded safe range on the trucks, Mr. Stroud. Not by a lot, but enough that I had to note it. Company policy. And quote. Whose policy? And quote. Yours technically. And quote. Then technically, and quote. Desmond said, and quote. You also have discretion in how a minor brief excursion gets characterized. And oppose, flagged for review and oppose, reads very differently to our insurers than and oppose, discarded due to safety failure and oppose. One of those numbers appears in a report the board sees quarterly. The other doesn't and oppose need to appear anywhere at all. And quote. There was a pause on the line, the particular silence of a man doing math about his contract renewal. And quote. I don't and oppose want to create a paper trail that makes us look reckless over 3 pallets of lettuce, and quote. Desmond continued. And quote, I want you to use good judgment. That and oppose, all I and oppose, ever asked of any vendor. Good judgment. And quote. I understand and quote. Oscar said, and Desmond could hear, even through the phone, The exact moment the man decided it was easier to understand than to argue. End quote. Good, end quote, Desmond said. End quote. We renew in March, by the way. I like doing business with people who understand things quickly. End quote. He hung up and turned back to his desk, where a folder sat labeled North Range, final commissioning, a project 7 months closed and, as far as he was concerned, 7 months forgotten. He had learned early that most people, faced with a choice between a difficult truth and a comfortable one, would choose comfort if you simply made comfort the path of least resistance. It rarely required threats. It required only the suggestion that the truth would cost them something, and the patience to let them talk themselves into agreeing. It had worked on Oscar Reyes. It had worked mostly on the dozen employees who and Oppos quietly rewritten reports at his request over the past 2 years. It had not worked on Nora Ellison, and that refusal, small, specific, professionally inconvenient, was the one loose thread in an otherwise tidy tenure that Desmond had never quite managed to stop thinking about. He told himself this was because her insubordination had nearly cost the company its opening date. He did not examine closely why a technician he and Oppos fired 7 months ago still occupied a folder on his desk instead of a shredder. His assistant knocked. And quote, "Your aunt is online too. She wants to know if you and Oppos decided about Fort Collins." End quote. Desmond checked his watch. His uncle Daniel and Oppos' funeral had been 6 weeks ago. Since then, Margaret had missed 2 board calls, 3 donor events, and according to Frank, her driver, who reported to Desmond more than he reported to Margaret, a fact Margaret didn't and Oppos know most of her meals. Desmond had been serving as acting chief executive since Daniel entered hospice, and the board vote to make it permanent was scheduled for Monday. All that remained was Margaret and Oppos' signature transferring her voting shares into a family trust and quote, "for ease of estate management" and quote, a document his lawyer had drafted and that Margaret, in her grief, had not yet found the will to either sign or refuse. And quote, "Tell her I and Oppos, I'll call after my 2-0 and Oppos clock" and quote, Desmond said and went back to the folder on his desk and did not open it. By that afternoon, an independent contractor had inspected the pastry case at the Larkspur table and confirmed what Nora had guessed from a booth. A failing relay had kept the compressor from holding safe temperature for nearly 2 hours. Because the staff had moved the food quickly, the café avoided serving anything that should have been discarded, and avoided a loss the contractor estimated at close to $5,000. He also noted, almost as an aside, that the same alarm had been silenced 3 times in the previous month without a full service call. At 3:30, Margaret sat in the back of her car outside the house she and Oppos barely left in 10 days. Eli and Oppos' scarf was still around her shoulders. The house beyond the window looked exactly as it had that morning. Curtains drawn, porch light off in daylight, the newspaper still in its plastic sleeve on the walk. Her daughter Claire and Oppos' unopened birthday card sat on the hall table inside, because Margaret had not yet been able to make herself throw them away, and today of all days Claire would have turned 44. For the past 6 weeks, visitors had come to that house carrying documents. Prove this. Sign here. Transfer authority. A stranger, a delivery driver in a faded jacket, and her son, who thought an empty bowl might be needed by someone else, had asked for nothing at all. Margaret picked up her phone and called Renata Cole, Larkspur Provisions and Oppos' General Counsel. End quote. "I need you to look into someone," end quote, Margaret said. End quote. "Who?" End quote. End quote. "Nora Ellison," end quote. End quote. "What am I looking for?" End quote. End quote. "Her employment history here. Her credentials. Whether she still has any connection to the company." End quote. A pause. End quote. "Was she involved in the incident at the café this morning?" End quote. End quote. "She and Oppos' the reason it didn't and Oppos' become a $5,000 mistake and a health code violation." End quote. End quote. "I and Oppos' I'll pull the file." End quote. End quote. "Renata." End quote. End quote. "Yes." End quote. End quote. "Do it quietly. I Don and Oppos' want this filtered through Desmond and Oppos' office before it reaches me." End quote. 2 hours later, Renata called back, and something in her voice had changed. Flatter, more careful. The tone of a lawyer who has found something she isn't and oppose. T sure how to characterize yet. End quote. Nora Ellison. End quote. End quote. Attendance problems. End quote. End quote. None. Strong reviews for 13 straight years. One written warning filed 9 days before termination. End quote. End quote. For what? End quote. End quote. Refusing to sign a commissioning report. End quote. Renata paused. End quote. For the North Range facility. End quote. Something surfaced in Margaret and Oppo's memory, slow and unwelcome, like a stone rising through still water. Weeks before the end, when Daniel could still hold a conversation for 10 or 15 minutes at a time, he and Oppo's mentioned a technician and Oppo's name in connection with a dispute over the North Range opening, said something about a woman who and Oppo's been pushed out for refusing to approve a report she didn't, and Oppo's Trust said he intended to look into it himself once he was stronger. He had never gotten stronger. A nurse had come in to check his medication, and the conversation had ended, and Margaret, drowning in her own version of the same grief that would later put her at a table alone on a Saturday morning, had never returned to it. End quote. Who signed her termination? End quote. Margaret asked, though some part of her already suspected the answer. Renata hesitated. End quote. Desmond. End quote. Margaret closed her eyes. Desmond had become acting chief executive the week Daniel entered the hospital, and had called her nearly every day since the funeral, asking in a voice practiced into gentleness, when she and Oppo's be ready to sign the voting trust. She had told herself the persistence was concern. End quote. Pull the complete file. End quote. Margaret said. End quote. Everything connected to North Range. Everything connected to Nora Ellison. I Don and Oppo's care how far back it goes. End quote. End quote. I and Oppo's LL need authorization from someone in operations to access some of it. End quote. End quote. You have mine. In writing within the hour. End quote. End quote. Margaret. End quote. Renata and Oppo's voice softened just slightly, out of the careful neutrality lawyers learn to keep. End quote. If this is what it looks like, it and Oppo's going to be difficult. For the company and for your family. End quote. End quote. My family. End quote. Margaret said. End quote. Has already cost one woman her career for telling the truth. I and Oppo's like to know exactly how before it costs anyone else anything. End quote. That evening Nora was on her back under a stranger in Oppo's washing machine, replacing a drain pump in the basement of an apartment building, when her phone rang against the concrete floor. End quote. Ms. Ellison? End quote. End quote. Yes. End quote. End quote. This is Margaret Voss. End quote. Nora sat up too fast and cracked her elbow on the machine and Oppo's frame. End quote. Did the scarf make it home okay? End quote. End quote. It did. It and Oppo's the warmest thing in my house right now, which is a fairly low bar, but I mean it as a compliment. End quote. A pause. End quote. The contractor confirmed what you said about the refrigerator. End quote. End quote. I and Oppo's am glad they caught it before it turned into something worse. End quote. End quote. I also learned you used to work for Larkspur Provisions. End quote. Nora and Oppo's hand tightened around the phone. End quote. I did. End quote. End quote. Why didn't and Oppo's you mention that this morning? End quote. End quote. You were having breakfast for the first time in what sounded like a while. It didn't and Oppo's seem like the moment. End quote. End quote. That is and Oppo's an answer. End quote. End quote. It and Oppo's the one I have. End quote. Margaret was quiet for a moment. Nora wiped grease from her fingers with a shop rag and waited. The way she used to wait for a compressor to cycle, listening for what came next instead of filling the silence herself. End quote. I and Oppo's like to hear what happened to you. End quote. Margaret said finally. End quote. In full. End quote. End quote. With your lawyer present. End quote. End quote. Yes. At Renata Cole and Oppo's office, not headquarters. Somewhere neutral. It and Oppo's LLB recorded for the record. Not for anyone to use against you. End quote. Nora looked at the drain pump in pieces on the floor beside her, at the basement and Oppo's single flickering bulb, and thought about 8 months of applications that asked, in some form or another, whether she and Oppo's ever been terminated for cause. She thought about Eli and Oppo's radiator clanking all night in an apartment that never quite warmed up. And quote, "What do you want from me?" And quote, she asked. And quote, "The truth." And quote. And quote. "And if the truth embarrasses your company?" And quote. And quote. "Then my company should be embarrassed." End quote. Margaret said without hesitation. And quote. "I and Oppo's rather it be embarrassed in a conference room than have it happen again to someone else in a public dining room." End quote. Nora looked at the ceiling of the basement, half a city block of cold concrete over her head, and thought about how long she and Oppo's waited for someone in that building to say a sentence like that. And quote, "I and Oppo's I'll be there." And quote, she said. Desmond heard about the request from his assistant the next morning, standing at his office window with his coffee going cold in his hand. And quote. "Legal pulled a full personnel file this morning." And quote, she said. And quote. "Nora Ellison flagged as executive priority." And quote. "He didn't an Oppo's turn around right away." And quote. "Who requested it?" And quote. And quote. "Renata Cole. Under Mrs. Voss and Oppo's authorization." And quote. He set the coffee down. 8 months ago this had been a closed matter. A technician who in Oppo's made a difficult project harder, removed, replaced, forgotten within a quarter. He called his aunt from his office, door shut, and she answered on the 5th ring. And quote, "Aunt Margaret, I heard you went out to that café by yourself yesterday. You should have told Frank in advance." And quote. And quote, "I did tell Frank. Where I go is not something I owe advance notice for, Desmond." And quote. And quote, "You Haven and Oppo's been eating. Haven and Oppo's been sleeping. It ISN and Oppo's safe for you to just wander off." And quote. The concern in his voice was smooth, well practiced. "She and Oppo's have believed it completely 6 weeks ago." And quote. "I met a woman named Nora Ellison yesterday." And quote, Margaret said. And quote. "Along with her son." And quote. Silence just long enough to notice. And quote. "That explains legal and Oppo's request." And quote. Desmond said. And quote. "Tell me about her." And quote. And quote. "She was a difficult employee who refused to follow the chain of command on a major project." And quote. And quote. "She recognized a refrigeration failure from across a dining room and possibly saved someone in that cafe from food poisoning." And quote. And quote. "That doesn't and Oppo's change what happened at North Range." And quote. And quote. "Then tell me what happened at North Range." And quote. And quote. "She delayed a $40 million facility opening and undermined management in front of contractors." And quote. And quote. "What specifically did she refuse to do?" And quote. "A beat." And quote. "Revise an alarmist report." And quote. And quote. "Was the report wrong?" And quote. And quote. "It was incomplete." And quote. And quote. "That SN and Oppo's what I asked Desmond." And quote. He walked to the window, the city laid out gray and orderly beneath him. And quote. "Aunt Margaret, you and Oppo's re-grieving. This woman saw you in a vulnerable moment and attached herself to the situation. It happens more than you and Oppo's think." And quote. And quote. "She didn't and Oppo's know my name until your driver walked through the door." And quote. And quote. "That and Oppo's what she says." And quote. And quote. "She shared the only breakfast she could afford with a stranger, Desmond. Her son gave me the scarf off his own neck. Explain to me what version of opportunism looks like that." And quote. And quote. "Children can be very persuasive tools, even without meaning to be." End quote. Margaret and Oppo's voice went very quiet, which Desmond would later understand was a far worse sign than if she and Oppo's raised it. And quote. "I want the complete file. Everything." And quote. And quote. "You have people for that." And quote. And quote. "They and Oppo's already working." And quote, she said, and hung up before he could say anything else. 2 days later, Nora sat at a conference table in Renata Cole and Appo's office wearing her cleanest work shirt, the one without a company logo peeling off. End quote. Margaret and Appo's face had gone very still, the same stillness Nora had seen at the café, right before the tears came. End quote. What happened after you refused to sign it? End quote, Margaret asked. End quote. I was removed from the project. 2 weeks later I was terminated. End quote. End quote. Did you appeal? End quote. End quote. Yes. I was told management had acted within its discretion. End quote. End quote. What did it cost you? End quote, Margaret asked. Nora looked away. End quote. That ISN and Appo's part of the technical record. End quote. End quote. It and Appo's part of the truth. End quote. Nora exhaled slowly. Then she told them, the health insurance that ended the same week as her severance, the truck she and Appo's sold to make rent, the calls that stopped coming back once insubordination started following her name through an industry small enough that everyone eventually heard everything, the apartment above the laundromat with the radiator that never worked right, Eli sleeping in his hat because his room stayed cold all winter. End quote. Does your son know why you moved? End quote. Margaret asked quietly. End quote. He knows I changed jobs. That and Appo's all. End quote. End quote. That and Appo's all you told him? End quote. End quote. He and Appo's 7. End quote, Nora said. End quote. I wasn't and Appo's going to make him the audience for a fight between me and a company he and Appo's will never meet. End quote. Renata stopped the recorder. End quote. I need to search the archived review files. Daniel Voss and Appo's files specifically. End quote. Margaret and Appo's breath caught at her husband and Appo's name. End quote. Why? End quote. End quote. Before he entered hospice, Daniel asked legal to preserve a set of records related to contractor substitutions and cost reduction decisions across several facilities, North Range among them. His review was never completed. End quote. The archive turned up the following morning. Inside were Nora and Appo's original test data and photographs of the substituted condenser units, alongside a chain of internal emails, the most damning of which had come from Desmond 3 days before Nora and Appo's termination. The language needs to reflect business judgment, not technician anxiety. Adjust the conclusion and keep us on schedule. There was also a short, unfinished note in Daniel and Appo's handwriting, scanned and dated 11 days before he entered the hospital. Ellison and Appo's termination requires independent review. Technical record does not support the personnel conclusion. Margaret read it twice. Her husband had not finished the investigation he and Appo's started. Illness had taken that from both of them, but he had seen enough in the last weeks he had to question what his own company had done. She thought of the unopened cards on the hall table, of Claire and Appo's birthday, of a scarf that had ended up around her shoulders because a boy decided nobody should wait outside in the cold, and understood with a clarity grief hadn't and Appo's allowed her in weeks exactly what she needed to do next. The board was scheduled to vote on Desmond and Appo's permanent appointment as chief executive in 4 days. End quote. They and Appo's I'll see this before the vote. End quote, Margaret said. It wasn't an Appo's a question. Desmond learned about the archive before the weekend, from a nervous call from Renata and Appo's paralegal that he wasn't an Appo's supposed to receive. By Saturday morning, he was sitting across from Priya Nash in the back office of the Larkspur table, a folded sheet of paper on the desk between them. Priya had already received written notice that her handling of Margaret Voss and Appo's visit was under formal review. She was frightened in the specific way of someone who has spent a career being replaceable, and has just learned exactly how replaceable feels from the inside. End quote. This gives legal a fuller picture of that morning. End quote. Desmond said, sliding the paper toward her. End quote. Context matters. Right now the narrative is that you humiliated the company and Appo's founder over nothing. I and Appo's like the record to reflect what actually happened. End quote. Priya read it. The statement said Nora Ellison had interfered with company equipment without authorization, disrupted service to other guests, and used the confusion to insert herself into Margaret Voss and Appo's personal life. End quote. that ISN and Oppos. T what happened and quote, Priya said. And quote, you told me yourself not to let her touch the case. She never touched it. She told Sophia to check the temperature. And the milk was already at 47 degrees before anyone did anything else. End quote. End quote. She influenced staff to take actions outside their normal procedure. End quote. End quote. Because the alarm was going off and the display said 48. End quote. Desmond leaned forward slightly. End quote. The board meets Monday to decide whether my aunt and Oppos' judgment and by extension, everyone whose employment depends on decisions made under her authority, can still be trusted after a difficult year. A complete statement from you would help them understand the pressure that morning put everyone under. Including you. End quote. It wasn't an Oppos, T a direct threat. It didn't an Oppos. T need to be. Priya had worked in enough restaurants under enough owners to translate corporate language into what it actually meant. End quote. I need some time, end quote, she said. End quote. You Don and Oppos. T have much. End quote. He left the statement on her desk and walked out without waiting for an answer, the way men who are used to being obeyed often do. Priya sat alone in the office for a long time after he left. She thought about the trembling in Margaret and Oppos' hands that she and Oppos' mistaken for a threat instead of grief. She thought about the exact moment she and Oppos' decided without evidence that an old woman in a wrinkled coat didn't and Oppos' belong in her café, and how quickly once she and Oppos' learned the woman and Oppos' net worth, her judgment of the situation had flipped entirely, which told her something uncomfortable about what her judgment had actually been measuring all along. It hadn't and Oppos' been about whether Margaret could pay. It had been about whether Margaret looked like someone who could. She thought about Sophia checking that milk without being told twice, and about Nora, who had never once raised her voice in the whole encounter, who and Oppos' simply kept saying true things until someone finally listened. On Sunday, Renata Cole reviewed the café and Oppos' security footage as part of the broader investigation. It showed everything exactly as it happened. Nora never touching the refrigerated case, Sophia performing the temperature check herself, staff moving product only after the reading confirmed the failure. It also showed, in a wide-angle frame near the register, the 11 minutes before Frank arrived, when Nora had simply pulled up a chair for a stranger and split a meal 3 ways because it seemed like the only decent thing to do. When Renata interviewed Priya that afternoon, Priya began by repeating the version Desmond had given her. Halfway through she stopped. End quote. He wanted me to make her sound dangerous, end quote, Priya said. End quote, Ellison. He wanted the file to say she was some kind of manipulator. End quote. End quote. Did he threaten you? End quote. End quote, not directly. He said the board would be deciding whether my judgment could still be trusted, and that a complete statement would help them understand the pressure I was under. End quote. Priya slid the folded draft across the table. End quote. I got Mrs. Voss wrong once already because I judged her by her coat instead of asking a single question. I and Oppos' am not signing another wrong thing just to save myself. End quote. Monday and Oppos' board meeting began at 9:00 and Oppos' clock and had originally been scheduled for a single item, confirming Desmond Stroud as permanent chief executive of Larkspur Provisions. Instead, Renata opened with a motion to amend the agenda, and the room and Oppos' attention shifted uneasily toward the far end of the table where Desmond sat. Margaret sat at the center, dressed in something other than black for the first time since the funeral. Eli and Oppos' green scarf, cleaned and reknotted where a seam had come loose, hung around her neck. Renata walked the board through the evidence in order. Nora and Oppos' original test data and the altered version filed in her place, Desmond and Oppos' email instructing the change, the disciplinary action that began 9 days after her refusal to sign, Daniel and Oppos' unfinished note questioning the termination, the café and Oppos' security footage, and finally Priya and Oppos' statement describing the pressure she and Oppos' been placed under to misrepresent what had happened. Desmond kept his composure. End quote. This is being presented without operational context, end quote. He said. End quote. The facility opened successfully. The system was adjusted. No product was lost. No one was ever injured, end quote. A board member named Walter Higuchi, silver-haired and unhurried, leaned forward. And quote, was the system adjusted before or after Ms. Ellison was terminated? And quote. Desmond paused half a second too long. And quote. So the report that certified the facility as safe to open was not, in fact, the report your own technician submitted, end quote. It was a clarification, end quote. Walter looked at Nora, seated at the end of the table with her hands folded, invited only to answer technical questions. End quote. Ms. Ellison, was the original system proven unsafe? End quote. No, end quote. Was it proven stable under full operating load? End quote. No. That was the entire point of my objection. It hadn't and oppose. Been proven either way, end quote. What were you asked to sign? End quote. A statement saying the data showed stable operation. End quote. Why did you refuse? End quote. Because it didn't and oppose. Show that. It showed the opposite. End quote. Desmond turned toward her, the calm finally cracking at the edges. End quote. You could have respected the chain of command. End quote. I used the appeal process that exists for exactly this situation. End quote. You challenged executive judgment in front of contractors. End quote. I answered a commissioning question in front of the people performing the commissioning. That and oppose. The job. End quote. You delayed a $40 million facility opening. End quote. The compressor system delayed it. I only refused to pretend otherwise. End quote. The room went quiet enough that the hum of the building and oppose's HVAC system was audible, which struck Nora absurdly as the only honest sound in the room. Desmond and oppose's expression hardened into something closer to what he must have looked like in the room where he and oppose fired her. End quote. You always believed your technical opinion outweighed the needs of the company. End quote. Nora met his eyes. End quote. Refusing to certify something unproven wasn't and oppose disloyalty. End quote. She let the pause sit there before she finished it. End quote. It was the job I was hired to do. End quote. Renata displayed the draft statement Desmond had brought to Priya. End quote. This was produced after legal reopened Ms. Ellison and oppose's file and after Mrs. Voss authorized the investigation. Mr. Stroud, did you ask Ms. Nash to state that Ms. Ellison interfered with company equipment? End quote. I asked for a complete account of the incident. End quote. Had you reviewed the security footage before requesting that account? End quote. No. End quote. Did you tell Ms. Nash the board would be evaluating whether her judgment could still be trusted? End quote. Desmond didn't and oppose answer. Margaret finally spoke, quiet enough that the whole table leaned toward her without meaning to. End quote. You told me Nora used my grief to attach herself to me. End quote. I was protecting you. End quote. No. End quote. Margaret said. End quote. You were protecting the story you and oppose already decided to tell before you and oppose checked a single fact in it. End quote. Desmond leaned forward, voice dropping into something more personal, more pleading. End quote. Aunt Margaret, you met a stranger during the worst month of your life, and now you and oppose letting one breakfast reorganize this company and oppose's leadership. End quote. Margaret touched the scarf at her throat. End quote. The breakfast didn't and oppose create any of this evidence, Desmond. It only made me willing to finally look at it. End quote. The board moved into executive session. Nora waited alone in an empty conference room down the hall, watching a slow line of cars circle the parking structure below, not knowing whether her name would be cleared or simply filed away as one more inconvenient footnote. Her phone buzzed. A message from her sister, who had Eli for the afternoon. He wants to know if the truth won yet. Nora looked at the words for a long moment before she typed back. They and oppose still deciding. 26 minutes later, Renata came to find her. End quote. The board has suspended Desmond Stroud from all executive authority, effective immediately, pending an independent investigation into the North Range matter and related personnel actions. End quote. Nora let out a breath she felt like she and Oppos. D been holding for 7 months. End quote. And the CO appointment. End quote. End quote. Removed from consideration permanently, regardless of the investigation and Oppos' outcome. End quote. End quote. And my file. End quote. End quote. Your termination is now listed as disputed, pending final review. Compensation, benefits, and any related damages will be evaluated as part of that review. End quote. End quote. That is and Oppos. T the same as clearing my name. End quote. End quote. No. End quote. Renata agreed. End quote. But it and Oppos. The door opening, not the room. End quote. The independent investigation took 6 weeks. It confirmed that Desmond had altered technical reporting on at least 2 projects beyond North Range, concealed cost-cutting substitutions from the board, retaliated against Nora for refusing to falsify her findings, and pressured Priya to provide a misleading statement during an active internal review. The board terminated his employment outright. He lost his succession bonus, his equity acceleration, and any claim to the office he and Oppos. D spent 2 years quietly arranging his uncle and Oppos' illness to hand him. His remaining contractual disputes were referred to outside counsel, and Larkspur Provisions began the slower, less satisfying work of deciding how many other files needed the same scrutiny his had received. Nora and Oppos' personnel record was formally corrected. Larkspur Provisions acknowledged in writing that her technical objection had been valid and that her termination had been retaliatory. A negotiated settlement restored her lost wages, benefits, and retirement contributions for the 7 months she and Oppos' been gone, and covered, quietly and without being asked, the difference in rent between the duplex she and Oppos' left and the apartment above the laundromat. Margaret offered her a senior position outright, Director of Cold Chain Integrity, reporting straight to the executive floor. Nora turned it down. End quote. I don't and Oppos' want a title I didn't and Oppos' earn on a hiring panel. End quote. She told Margaret over coffee 2 weeks after the board and Oppos' decision. End quote. I want the job I would have gotten if none of this had ever happened to me. End quote. So instead she accepted a 30-day independent assessment contract. 3 facilities, full access to maintenance and inspection records. A final presentation to a hiring panel that, at Nora and Oppos' specific request, included no one from the Voss family. She spent those 30 days the way she and Oppos' spent the 13 years before her termination, checking compressors at 6 in the morning, cross-referencing service logs against manufacturer specs, writing reports nobody had told her to soften. Halfway through at the second facility, she found a maintenance contractor who and Oppos' been signing off on inspections he hadn't and Oppos' actually performed, saving the company from an outage that would have cost far more than her old salary ever had. She wrote it up plainly, the way she wrote everything, and sent it up the chain without waiting to see who it might upset. At the end of the 30 days, the panel offered her a position suited to what she actually knew how to do. Regional Maintenance Integrity Supervisor. It didn't and Oppos' make her wealthy. It gave her stable hours, health insurance that covered Eli and Oppos' dentist appointments without her doing math in the parking lot first, and work that let her sign her own name to something without wondering whether it would still say what she meant by the time it reached a board. Priya kept her job, but not her management title. She was placed in a service standards retraining program and required to complete a full review of the café and Oppos' food safety and customer treatment procedures before she and Oppos' be considered for any promotion again. Desmond had pressured her, but he hadn't and Oppos' made her judge Margaret by the wrinkles in her coat. That decision in the 2 minutes before anyone knew who Margaret was, had been entirely Priya and Oppos' own, and she and Oppos' stopped pretending otherwise. She cooperated fully with the investigation and apologized to Margaret in person, without asking for forgiveness in return, which Margaret noticed, and appreciated more than an apology that had asked for something back. Sophia, the young server who and Oppos' checked the milk without waiting to be told twice, was offered a scholarship through a program Larkspur Provisions quietly funded for hourly employees pursuing further education. She was, as of that spring, 6 credits into an associate in Oppos' degree in food safety and quality assurance, and had told anyone who asked that she wanted eventually Nora and Appo's old job, the one where you got to be the person who noticed the thing before it became a $5,000 mistake. On his last day at Larkspur Provisions, Desmond returned his access badge and collected the contents of his office into a single cardboard box. He passed Nora in the hallway. He finished cooperating with the audit, handed over every record the investigators requested, and left the building the same way he and Appo's once made other people leave it, quietly carrying a box with no one holding the door. Margaret returned to public life slowly. Grief didn't and Appo's disappear. She still woke some mornings reaching for her phone before remembering Claire would never call, but she began having dinner with Nora and Eli on Sundays, then attending Eli and Appo's school music program from a folding chair in the back row, then sitting through an entire Saturday science fair where Eli built a cardboard model of a refrigerated delivery truck and announced, with the total confidence of an 8-year-old who has heard his mother explain the same principle a dozen times, that warm milk was bad business and also, frankly, disgusting. Margaret laughed harder than anyone else in the gymnasium. One evening that spring she sat at Nora and Appo's kitchen table, glasses pushed down her nose, repairing a loose seam in the green scarf with a needle she and Appo's had to ask Eli to thread for her. And quote, "Grandma, you missed a spot," and quote, Eli said, peering over her shoulder. The room went quiet. Nora at the stove didn't and Appo's turn around, but she stopped stirring. Eli looked up, suddenly unsure. And quote, is it okay if I call you that? And quote, Margaret and Appo's hands stilled on the fabric. And quote, yes, and quote, she said when she trusted her voice again. And quote, that is very okay. And quote, Larkspur Provisions restored a community meal program that Daniel had started decades earlier, and that had quietly lapsed over the years, buried under budget cuts nobody had bothered to justify out loud. Customers experiencing hardship could request a meal discreetly, without explaining themselves to a manager or a crowded room. No one was photographed for a marketing campaign. No employee was permitted to make a person and Appo's hunger into a company and Appo's publicity. A small brass bowl was placed by the register at every Larkspur table location. Customers could contribute anonymously, and the company matched what came in every month, without a press release attached to it. The first bowl was installed at the original café on Larkspur Avenue, several months after the morning that had changed all three of their lives. Nora, Eli, and Margaret returned there together. The wind outside was sharp, but the sky had gone a hard, clean blue. Priya met them at the door herself. And quote, "Good morning, Mrs. Voss." And quote, "Good morning, Priya." And quote, Priya glanced at Nora. And quote, "Miss Ellison," and quote, then at Eli, and the scarf mended and a little too small for him now, still wrapped twice around his neck out of habit more than need. And quote, "I like the scarf." And quote, Eli grinned. And quote, "It and Appo's warm." And quote, they took the booth at table 7. Nora ordered 3 full breakfasts, blueberry pancakes for Margaret, eggs and toast for Eli, coffee and a skillet for herself. When the food arrived, Eli looked at the size of his own plate and grinned. And quote, "This is way more than last time." And quote, "Things are better now," and quote, Nora said. Eli glanced toward the brass bowl by the register, where a small folded card read, "No one has to prove they deserve a warm meal." He slid out of the booth and came back a moment later carrying an empty bowl of his own, which he set down carefully in the middle of the table. Nora raised an eyebrow. And quote, "What and Appo's that for?" And quote, "In case someone needs it," and quote, Eli said like it was the most obvious thing in the world. Margaret touched the scarf at her shoulders, the one a boy had given her before either of them knew the other and Appo's name, and felt something in her chest that had been closed for a long time settle, quietly, into place. A few minutes later the door opened, and an old man walked in alone. His coat was thin. His hands, red from the cold, hovered near the register as he read the prices without sitting down. Eli looked at his mother. Nora looked at Margaret. Margaret picked up the empty bowl, and then without a word waved the man toward table 7.